Music theory with OneNote. Modal ranges, adding another layer of information on top of the music equations. Sick of numbers, sick of notes? That's okay because we could do it by color alone. That's what we will be doing here. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 2156, OneNote Modal Ranges with Color. List of presentations on the right, which we plan on adding plenty more to shortly. Also noting, in this OneNote presentation, we spend all our time on music theory, but we have another similarly numbered and named presentation where we actually build out these tables in Excel, practicing music, Excel, and just table visualization skills at the same time. Let's get a reminder of what we're trying to do as we work with color, that being to maximize, optimize the use of color to best understand music theory and be able to create tools, for example, to help us navigate the fretboard. To do that, we want to have a standard kind of color system mapping the actual color wheel onto the note wheel and possibly doing a similar process for distance notation. For example, this fretboard has the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling. On top, we have the collection of 7 notes around the key of C or the C major. We have the color scheme here tied to those notes. So each note then has a different color. So that would be using a color system that ties to a particular point. Now, if we change the collection of notes to the notes around the D major, so you can see the Ionian was on the C, now the Ionian is on the D, the A here is still red because the color system is then tied to the notes. However, we might also want to adjust the color system so it is tied to the relative positions, the Nashville number systems, for example, which is basically a modal system. And if we did that, we have the same starting point with the same colors around the 7-note collection of the C major, but this time the colors are tied to the nodes, the Ionian, the Phrygian, or from a Nashville number system, the 1, the 4, the 3. Then, if we move from the 7-note collection around the C major to the 7-note collection around the D major, this Ionian is on the C, now it's on the D, the whole color system moves up. So those are the two ways that we can visualize the color system as a point to help us think about where are what I would call the continents in our analogy we looked at in a prior course or section. All the continents have something in them. The ones that are blank, I'm going to call those the oceans. Those are the ones in the middle. Now, I would also like a color system for distance. How far is something away? And if we have a local distance, meaning like a clock, we're going around a track, just counting as we go around, we have once again like 12 different distances. So we could come up with a fretboard that basically helps us to map that out by breaking each of the frets, having a 2-tiered color system for each of the frets. So for example, here we have once again the fret 5, which is going to be our position number 1, but it's much wider here because I've included a color system for the points, which are tied out to the modal points or the nodes. And then we have another side to each of the frets, which are measuring the distance. And we'll get into different naming conventions for the distances later. But from a color standpoint, we have a different set of 12 colors for the distance notation, noting that if we have the same collection of notes, the distances will be dependent upon which of those notes I'm seeing as the center. In other words, what chord am I on or what mode am I on? So in our Excel worksheet, we'll be able to adjust this second note from the perspective of whatever chord we're building off of the 7-note collection, helping us to basically build chords. Really useful thing. I know it's kind of a convoluted fretboard look here, but it's a great tool and you can adjust it so that it doesn't show you the 2 formats of distance or the 2 formats of points, whatever we want to be focusing in on, so we can make it a little bit tighter if we needed to. But hopefully you can see why that could be useful and how the color system could also be a way to visualize this whole thing. And that's what we'll be working on here. So let's do a quick recap of the color system that we've done thus far. We applied the color wheel. I'm just taking the color wheel that has been generated into a circle, which they kind of fudged from the physics color wheel, but we're going to say we're cool with that because it's a perfect analogy for our notes. If we assign the colors, we can assign them to the notes, that being to the points, and then we also might want to fix them in a similar way as we do in the Nashville number system, fixing the mode system to a number, also similarly to a color, and those are the two ways we can see it by point. So just to recap, a 1 is an A and it's red. So if I say red, that could also mean the red note is the 1 or the A. A 2 is an A sharp or a B flat, it's orange or orange red. So if I say something is orange, it's going to be an A sharp or a B flat or the second note. A 3 is a B, it's yellow. So if I say it's the yellow note, it's a B or the 3 note. The 4 is C, it's yellow-green. So if I say a yellow-green note, that's the C note, that's the 4 note. The 5 is a C sharp or a D flat, it's just flat green. So if I say the green note, it means C sharp or D flat. The 6 is a D note, it's spring green. So if I say spring green, it means D or 6. Now also note that if I was to apply the formula of whole, half, whole, half to the notes here based on the key of C, we end up with the non-sharp or flats notes. And that's what I'm going to base the color system on for the equivalent in color to like the Nashville number system, meaning we have a fixed color for all 12 sets of 7 notes based on the relative positions, which we've used an analogy to be the continents in a prior presentation. So in other words, I don't care what collection of 7 notes we are in, if we lock the color so that the Ionian is the same color in the 7 note position around the key of C, then it's always going to be, Ionian's going to be yellow-green. Meaning, if I have the 7 note collection around the B, and I'm looking at it not tying the color to the note, but rather tying the color to the mode, then I wouldn't call it the B note, I'd call it the Ionian note, the Ionian continent in the 7 note collection around the B, and it would be yellow-green. It would be green-yellow or yellow-green, right? And so then spring green would be the D, it's the Dorian, because I have a whole step to the Dorian, therefore Dorian is going to be the spring green if I'm using a standard system based on the modes. The 7 is the D sharp or E flat. It's going to be cayenne. So if I say cayenne from a note perspective, it would be a D sharp or an E flat. An 8 is going to be an E sky blue. So from a note perspective, the sky blue will be E or note number 8. However, from a modal perspective, that means all 12 collections of 7 notes, if I tie it to the mode, will also be sky blue. So if I say it's the Phrygian mode, using a permanent color system for the mode, the Phrygian mode color is going to be sky blue. Note 9 is F, that's going to be just normal blue. And if I tie it to the mode, that would be the Lydian mode. So if I say whatever collection of notes I'm in, I say we're on the Lydian or the blue mode, then that's going to be the Lydian mode. So the 10 is F sharp or G flat. That's going to be violet. And then we have the 11, which is going to be G. That's going to be a magenta. Magenta lines up to Mixolydian. So if no matter what collection of notes, if we're tying it to the modes and I say it's the magenta modal point, then that's going to be the Mixolydian modal point, no matter which collection of notes. 12 is going to be G sharp or A flat, which is rose. And then we go around the horn to A. So A was up here. We already did that, right? But we started on C to pick out our modes that we're going to be working in. And that's a little bit wonky because you might say we should have done it from A so the modes have the same color system starting at the beginning of the spectrum as it's laid out in our circle. But no, we kind of want to do it from C because C is the most common one to be playing in. Therefore, I think it makes the most sense to use the system based on the C major. So that means if I say something is red from a modal standpoint, I mean it's going to be the Aeolian mode. If I say something is going to be yellow from a modal standpoint, it's going to be the Locrian. All right, then we just repeated these again down here, but that's going to be the general idea. So then if I give an abbreviation, if we just list out the 7-note collection around the key of C, and we imagine that we're going to use that 7-note collection to then apply our color system to, this should be a 1 here. So this is the C, it should be a 1. That's going to be the Ionian. That's just the 3-note abbreviation. The smallest abbreviation, we're going to put a small I. The D for the key of C would be the Dorian. That would be the 2 that you can't see because it's too small, but that would be the Dorian. The E would be the Phrygian, which is the 3. The F would be the Lydian, which is LYD or the Y. And the G is going to be the 5, which is Mixolydian, which is magenta, which has an X as an abbreviation. The A would be the 6, which would be the Aeolian, A as abbreviation, red. The B is going to be the 7, Loc, and the N is the abbreviation because it's Locrian and it's crazy. So we go from the back, so these are going to be my abbreviated names. The numbers are better seen down here, 1 through 7, as we repeat them. Now in Excel, these are conditionally formatted. So if you wanted to build this in Excel and practice conditional formatting, there is a skill to it. So we do this in Excel. It's more tedious than you would think at first, but we've done that. So then on this side, we also have modal ranges. Now we've talked about so there's going to be 2 formats of distance that we have. Let's first look at normal distance. So when we think about distance, we're going to say, if I think about going around a clock in a clockwise direction, then each point has 12 different distances if I count the point that we're on. So that means I have another set of colors based on distances. So in other words, if I don't go anywhere or I go around the octave, I'm going to say I'm at the same point. We're going to call that orange flame. Maybe we just call it flame because we already have an orange, right? And so then if I go 1 step up, we're going to call that amber gold. I don't care if you call that 1 step from a naming convention, a half step, or a 1 note away minor second. I'm going to say the distance is the same. 1/2 step, it's going to be amber or gold. I'll call it amber. So then if we go 2 up, then that distance, I don't care if you call it a major second or a whole step or 2 half steps, the distance is the same. In the base unit half step, it's going to be chartreuse. And then 3 steps up, if we go 3 distance, I don't care if you call it a minor third or 3 half steps or a whole step and a half step, we're going to call that lime. Let's just stick with lime. If we go 4 steps up, I don't care if you call that a major third, 2 whole steps, 4 half steps, it's going to be just mint, let's say. And if you go 5 steps up, I don't care if you call it like a perfect fifth, or a major third and a half step or whatever you want to call it. I'm going to call it aqua. If we're going to say it's 6 steps up, we're going to say that's electric sky. If it's 7 steps up, I don't care if it's a perfect fifth or whatever you want to call it, we're going to say that's going to be deep azure or just azure if it's 7. 8 steps up is going to be ultraviolet. Let's just call it grape. We'll just call it grape. And then 9 steps up is going to be orchid. And then 10 steps up, fuchsia amber. And then 11, crimson. Well, let's just call it punch. We'll call it punch or crimson. I don't know which one it would be better, crimson or punch. Either one, I guess I'll have to decide as we go. And then if we go an octave lower, then if I go 1 step negative, notice that's the same as a local distance clockwise of going 11 up. In other words, 11 minus 12 is -1. So I'm going to call that crimson punch. If it was in the same octave, it would be the same a lightness. But if I want to take octaves into consideration, I can make it crimson punch, but a shade darker. If I go 2 steps back, that would be similar to going clockwise 10 steps. So I'm going to call that fuchsia amber, but it's a shade darker, and so on and so forth. And then we could do the same going up. So if I go up another step, 12 steps, then 12 minus 12 is 0. That would be like going all the way around. I'm back at flame, right? So orange flame or just flame. But now it's going to be an octave lighter. And then if I go 13, 13 minus 12 is 1. That would be same as amber, but now I'm going to say amber an octave lighter, and so on. Okay, now there's another distance tool that we've been using, and that's going to be modal half steps. What does that mean? Well, in our collection of notes here, if we say this is our collection of notes, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Most people would call that a scale and give them scale degrees. Now, the problem with scale degrees is that they're going to be relative to what the starting point is. So if I say I'm in the Dorian, well, you make that the 1, and then you count to 7. If I'm on the Lydian, you make that the 1, and then you count to 7. There's a problem with that functionally, because then I have to change. Why would I change the number functionally on the guitar? Or on whatever instrument, piano even. Why would you do that? That's going to make it more difficult. So we'd like to do the Nashville number system, keeping them the same, keeping the Mixolydian, all the node names the same. And it also makes sense to say, I'm not going to label these by scale degrees. I'm going to label them by the distance from whatever point I'm on based on this 7 collection of notes. Now, I'm not going to worry about, you might say, well, you can't do that because they're uneven distances, right? There's a different, like if I go from the 1 to the 2, there might, like the Ionian to the Dorian might have a different distance from the Phrygian to the Lydian, right? In total note distance. They're not even units like inches. They're not all even. But that's okay as long as I determine what the starting point is. If I know I'm going from the 3 to the 5 and I determine that I'm going from the 3 node to the 5 node, then it's always going to be the same. It's going to be uneven, possibly in the amount of notes in between each of them. But from a nodal standpoint, the progression will always be the same. So I could still measure distance this way. I just have to make sure that I know what the starting point is. So I'm going to call these modal half steps or nodal half steps. So I could then create a color convention for half steps, which I'm just going to use a gray tone. So if I don't go anywhere, it's going to be the lightest tone. I'm going to call that shades of gray 0. And then if I go 1 modal half step up, like if I move from the Ionian to the Dorian, right, it would be an ID modal range, has a modal distance of 1. That would be 1 shade of gray, right? And then if I go 2 up, like going from the Ionian to the Phrygian or the Dorian to the Lydian, that's going to be 2 shades of gray. If I go 3 modal half steps up, like Ionian to 1, 2, 3 the Lydian, or Phrygian 1, 2, 3 to the Aeolian, that's going to be 3 shades of gray. You see the pattern here, right? If I go 4 modal half steps up, that means I went a distance of 4 shades of gray. And if I go 5 modal half steps up, 5 shades of gray. And if I go 6 modal half steps up, 6 shades of gray. What if I go counterclockwise on the circle? I'm not going to take into account octaves here. What if I go, this is going clockwise, I can go 0 steps or 6 steps up, right? Because there's only 7 nodes, and that gives me 0 plus 6 shades of gray. If I go 1 step back and I keep the same color tone palette, then that would be equivalent to going 6 steps clockwise would be 1 step counterclockwise. So -1, you could call it a -1 shade of gray, but it's equivalent to 6 shades of gray, right? 6 steps forward. -2 shades of gray is equivalent to +5 shades of gray. -3 shades of gray is equivalent to +4 shades of gray, and so on. So that's going to be our modal half step. and they're kind of gray. I think gray is an analogy to indicate the fact that they're not going to be distances that are all the same. They're going to be dependent on what your starting point is, right? Because there could be a difference between the whole steps depending on where your starting and end point is, but they're still a useful tool. All right, so if we have all that, then we can look at our modal ranges. And you might say, what's a modal range again? I'll tell you what a modal range is. That is where we're like, if I have my map over here, again, this just makes sense. The fact that no one talks like this, I don't really understand, right? If you're playing Zelda or whatever the current video games are, and you have 5 different locations, let's call them continents. We have 7 different locations on our continent. What do I want to do? I want to know the distances. How do I get from one location to the other on the map? And then I want to memorize the entire map and be able to easily go from one location to the other location. It's even easier than Zelda or whatever the current game is because our map is in a circle. It's always in a circle. So all I need to know to get from any continent to any other continent is the starting point that I'm going on, the ending point, and then directionality. Am I going to go clockwise or counterclockwise around the track? So I might as well label them. If you're gonna logically think about it, you'd say, okay, well, let me name the starting point and all the starting point and ending points, which are all relatively the same for all 12 collections of 7 notes, and then I'll memorize the distance between each of them going both clockwise and counterclockwise. That would be the systematic way to do it, right? So you'd say, okay, if I'm on the Ionian, what are all the other continents I can go to in the 7-note collection from the continent of the Ionian? Well, from a natural number system, it would be 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, 1, 5, 1, 6, 1, 7. Or Ionian to Ionian, ID, Ionian to Dorian, IP, Ionian to Phrygian, IY, Ionian to Lydian, IX, Ionian to Mixolydian, IA, Ionian to Aeolian, IN, Ionian to Locrian. From a color standpoint, then, it would be Ionian yellow-green to yellow-green, Ionian yellow-green to Dorian spring-green, Ionian yellow-green continent to the Phrygian continent, which is the sky-blue continent, the Ionian yellow-green continent to the Lydian, which is the blue continent, the Ionian yellow-green continent to the Mixolydian, which is the magenta continent, the Ionian yellow-green continent to the Aeolian, which is the red continent, the Ionian yellow-green continent to the Locrian, which is the yellow continent. Then we can look at the distances. If I'm going clockwise, what's the distance? Yellow Ionian to Ionian is going to be a distance of 0 shades of gray because you didn't go anywhere. If you go from the Ionian to the Dorian, it's 1 modal half step up, which is 1 shade of gray. 1 shade of gray. If I go from the Ionian to the Phrygian, it's 2 shades of gray up. If I go from the Ionian to the Lydian, it's 3 shades of gray up. If I go to the Ionian to the Mixolydian, 4 shades of gray up. If I go to the Ionian to the Aeolian, 5, and so on. What about note half steps? So these are modal half steps going up from each of the modal points, the continents. The notes include what I'm calling oceans in between the continents. They include the other 5 notes that are not in this collection of notes. So Ionian to Ionian, you're going to go a distance of 0, which is a color we said was orange flame. If I go from the Ionian to the Dorian, we're going 2 up, which is chartreuse. If I go from the Ionian to the Phrygian, I'm going 4 note half steps up, or continents and oceans, which is going to be mint. If I go from the Ionian to Lydian, I'm going 5 notes up, which is going to be aqua. If I go from the Ionian to Mixolydian, I'm going 7 notes up, which is azure, which is a type of blue. Ionian, which you could see, to the Aeolian, I'm going to go 9 steps up, which we said was orchid. And if we go from the Ionian to the Locrian, it's 11 steps up, or clockwise, which we said was crimson or punch. Okay, so what if we go counterclockwise? If I go from the Ionian to Ionian counterclockwise, it doesn't matter. I land on the same spot, 0 modal half steps. Ionian to Dorian, I could go clockwise 1 modal half step or -6 counterclockwise, getting to the same spot, 1 shade of gray or -6 shades of gray, which are the same shade of gray. I could go from 1 Ionian to Phrygian, that would be 2 clockwise, which would be 5 counterclockwise. So that's going to be 2 shades of gray, which you could also say is also -5 shades of gray. Ionian to Lydian, then that's going to be 3 modal half steps clockwise, -4 counterclockwise, -3 shades of gray, or -3 and -4 shades of gray. If you go Ionian to Mixolydian, it's going to be 4 clockwise, -3 counterclockwise, so 4 shades of gray. If I go Ionian to Aeolian, it's going to be 5 clockwise, -2 counterclockwise, which would be 5 shades of gray. If we go Ionian to Locrian, 6 clockwise, -1 counterclockwise, 6 shades of gray. What about notes? Okay, let's start on the Dorian this time. If I go from the Ionian to the Dorian, it's going to be 2 note half steps forward clockwise. 12 minus 2 is -10 backwards. So if I go -10 is going to be chartreuse yellow. Same yellow here, but we showed now this time it's an octave lower if we want to put distance in there. So if I go from the Ionian to the Phrygian in notes, that would be 4 steps forward. 12 minus 4 is -8 note half steps backwards, and that's going to be then our mint. If we go from the Ionian to the Lydian, that's going to be 5 steps forwards. 12 minus 5 would be 7 steps counterclockwise, which would give us our color of aqua. And then if we go from the Ionian to Mixolydian, that would be 7 steps clockwise. 12 minus 7, -5 counterclockwise. So that's going to give us then our azure. And then if we go from the Ionian to Aeolian, that's going to be 9 clockwise, -3 counterclockwise. Okay, let me see if I can go through these a little bit faster so we can do a few of them. So let's just do the whole thing at a time as we go to the Dorian. So same exact thing for the Dorian. If I'm going to say, okay, let me list out all the possible places, continents I can go to from the Dorian and give me the distance clockwise and counterclockwise as we go around our world, which is structured in just a circle. So that means you can have a 2-2 distance, a 2-3, a 2-4, a 2-5, a 2-6, a 2-7, a 2-1, and that would be a DD, DP, DY, DX, DA, DN, DI modal ranges. Those are all the modal ranges you can have unless you include landing in the ocean, the 5 notes that are not included in the collection of 7 notes. So if I go from 2 to 2, or Dorian to Dorian, no modal half steps, therefore it's going to be a 0 shade of gray. This would be going from spring green to spring green, Dorian to Dorian. We're going to be going a note half step. We didn't move anywhere, so I'm just going to call that flame is the color. We had modal half steps is 0, and then if we go counterclockwise, and note half steps counterclockwise would be 0 or -12. All right, if I go from the 2 to the 3 modal range, or Dorian to Phrygian, spring green to sky blue, that would be 1 modal half step forward or clockwise, which would be 1 shade of gray. It would be 2 note half steps forward, or that would be our chartreuse, or -6 modal half steps backwards, which would be once again 1 shade of gray, or it would be 12 minus 2 or -10 note half steps counterclockwise, which would be the same chartreuse, but we're showing it a shade darker here. So we've got then the 2 to the 4 modal range, which would be Dorian to Lydian modal range, a DY modal range, spring green to blue modal range, 2 modal half steps up. That would be 2 shades of gray. It would be a distance of 3 note half steps clockwise, which would give us our lime color. And then it would be counterclockwise, -5 modal half steps, which would be equivalent to 2 shades of gray. And we would go counterclockwise 12 minus 3 or 9 steps counterclockwise to get to the same spot. But if I add distance, then it's going to give us our lime, but a shade darker. Okay, if I go from a 2-5, that would be Dorian Mixolydian, or spring green to magenta. It's going to be -3 modal half steps, would be 3 shades of gray. It's going to be 5 note half steps forward, which is going to be aqua. It's going to be counterclockwise, -4 modal half steps, which is still the 3 shades of gray. It's going to be 12 minus 5 or -7 note half steps counterclockwise, which would still be aqua, but a shade darker. They got the 2-6 modal range, the DA modal range, the Dorian Aeolian modal range, or the spring green red modal range, has a 4 modal half step up, 4 shades of gray, has a distance of 7 notes, which is going to be azure, and it has then a -3 modal half steps, which is 4 shades of gray still, and 12 minus 7 is -5 or counterclockwise 5 steps, which would still be azure, shade darker. A 2-7 modal range, Dorian Locrian modal range, a DN modal range, spring green to yellow modal range is 5 modal half steps forward, which is 5 shades of gray, 9 note half steps clockwise, which is orchid. It's -2 modal half steps counterclockwise, which would be still 5 shades of gray tone. 12 minus 9 is 3, so we have -3 or counterclockwise note half steps, which would still be orchid, but a shade darker. 2-1 modal range, DI modal range, Dorian Ionian modal range, spring green to yellow green, 6 modal half steps clockwise, 6 shades of gray would be 10 note half steps forward, which would be fuchsia, -1 modal half steps counterclockwise, which would still be 6 shades of gray. 12 minus 10 would be 2 note half steps counterclockwise, which would still be fuchsia, but counterclockwise. All right, let's go to the next one. Modal ranges. What if I start from the 3 continent, or the Phrygian continent, or the sky blue continent? Well, all the places I can go from there that don't land me in the ocean: 3-3, 3-4, 3-5, 3-6, 3-7, 3-1, 3-2, or PP, PY, PX, PA, PN, PI, PD. So if I look at all those, we're going to say, all right, if I go from a 3-3 sky blue to sky blue, it's Phrygian to Phrygian. It's going to be then 0 modal half steps, which is going to be 0 shades of gray, 0 note half steps, which is flame. It's going to be 0 modal half steps the other way, and so on. If I go to 3-4, that's going to be Phrygian to Lydian, sky blue to normal blue, 1 modal half step up, note half steps, 1 note half step, which is amber. It's going to be -6 note half steps counterclockwise, which will be still 1 shade of gray. 12 minus 1 is going to be -11 note half steps in the counterclockwise, which is once again amber, but a shade darker. We've got the 3-5 PX, Phrygian Mixolydian, sky blue to magenta, 2 modal half steps clockwise, which is 2 shades of gray. 3 note half steps forward, which is lime. -5 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still 2 shades of gray. And 12 minus 3 is -9 note half steps counterclockwise, which would be still the lime, but a shade darker. 3-6 modal range, PA modal range, Phrygian Aeolian modal range, sky blue red modal range, has 3 modal half steps clockwise, 3 shades of gray up. We have 5 note half steps, which is aqua. We have -4 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still 3 shades of gray. 12 minus 5 would give us -7 counterclockwise note half steps, which would still be aqua, but a shade darker. 3-7 modal range, PN modal range, Phrygian Locrian modal range, or sky blue yellow modal range, has 4 modal half steps forward, 4 shades of gray, which is going to be 7 note half steps forward, which is going to be azure, and it's got -3 modal half steps counterclockwise, which would still be 4 shades of gray. 12 minus 7 is 5 note half steps counterclockwise, which would still be azure, but a shade darker. 3-1 modal range, PI modal range, sky blue to yellow-green modal range is going to be 5 modal half steps forward, 5 shades of gray. It's going to be 8 note half steps forward or clockwise, which I'm just going to call grape. It's going to be -2 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still 5 shades of gray. 12 minus 8 gives us -4 note half steps counterclockwise, which would still be grape, but shade darker. 3-2 modal range, PD modal range, Phrygian Dorian modal range, sky blue to the spring green modal range is going to be 6 modal half steps forwards or clockwise, 6 shades of gray, having a distance of 10 note half steps, which is going to be fuchsia, and it's going to be -1 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still 6 shades of gray. 12 minus 10 is 2 steps counterclockwise, which is still fuchsia, but a shade darker. Next, if I'm on the Locrian node, the blue continent, then what are all the places I could go that don't land me on the ocean? You could go 4-4, 4-5, 4-6, 4-7, 4-1, 4-2, 4-3, or YY, YX, YA, YN, YI, YD, YP, YD, YP. What's the distances? Well, it's a 4-4. Y to Y, Lydian to Lydian, blue to blue, 0 modal half steps, 0 shades of gray, 0 note half steps, which is flame, 0 modal half steps the other way. You can go to 4-5, YX, Lydian mixolydian, blue to magenta. That's going to be 1 modal half step up, or 2 note half steps up, which is chartreuse, or -6 modal half steps counterclockwise, still 1 shade of gray. 12 minus 2 is 10. So that means we have 10, which is still going to be counterclockwise chartreuse, shade darker. 4-6 modal range, YA, Lydian Aeolian modal range, blue-red modal range, 2 modal half steps up, which is going to be 4 notes up, which is going to be mint, and it could have then 7 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is going to be still 2 shades of gray. 12 minus 4 is 8 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still going to be mint, but a shade darker. We then have a 4-7 modal range, which is a YN modal range, Lydian Locrian modal range, blue-yellow modal range, 3 modal half steps up, which is going to be 6 note half steps up, which is going to be electric sky, which is a weird one. We don't see that all the time. So that's that crazy distance. And that's going to be then, if I go modal half steps counterclockwise, -4, which is still 3 shades of gray. 12 minus 6 is also 6. So we have 6 counterclockwise, getting us to the same spot, which is still electric sky, but a shade darker. We've got the 4-1 modal range, the YI modal range, the Lydian Ionian modal range, the blue-yellow-green modal range, 4 modal half steps up. It's going to be 4 shades of gray, therefore 7 note half steps up, which is azure. We have -3 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still 4 shades of gray. And we have 12 minus 7 or 5 note half steps counterclockwise, which is still azure, but a shade darker. 4-2 YD, Lydian Dorian, blue spring green modal range, has a modal half step distance of 5 shades of gray, a note distance clockwise of 9, which is orchid, -2 counterclockwise modal half steps, which is still 5 shades of gray. 12 minus 9 is 3, giving us a counterclockwise note half step distance of 3, which is still orchid, but a shade darker. 4-3 YP, Lydian Phrygian, blue to sky blue, 6 modal half steps up, 6 shades of gray, 11 note half steps up, which is going to be crimson or punch. I still haven't decided which I like best. Could say both, crimson punch. And -1 modal half step counterclockwise, still 6 shades of gray. 12 minus 11 gives us 1 note half step counterclockwise, still crimson punch, but a shade darker. What about mixolydian? If we go to mixolydian, We have all the continent or combos that don't land us in the ocean. 5, 5, 5, 6, 5, 7, 5, 1, 5, 2, 5, 3, 5, 4, XX, XA, XN, XI, XD, XP, XY. So a 5, 5 would be XX, mixolydian, mixolydian, magenta to magenta, 0 modal half steps, 0 note half steps, which would be the flame color. 5, 6 would be mixolydian, aeolian, XA, which would be magenta, red, modal range, 1 modal half step up, 2 note half steps up, which is chartreuse, -6 modal half steps counterclockwise, which would still be 1 shade of gray, -10 note half steps counterclockwise, which would still be chartreuse, shade darker. 5, 7, XN modal range, magenta, yellow modal range, mixolydian, locrian modal range, 2 modal half steps up, 2 shades of gray, 4 note half steps up, which is mint, 5 modal half steps counterclockwise, still 2 shades of gray, 8 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still mint, but a shade darker. We got the 5-1 modal range, the XI modal range, the mixolydian Ionian modal range, magenta, yellow-green modal range, 3 modal half steps up, 3 shades of gray, 5 note half steps up, which is aqua, and we have 4, -4 modal half steps counterclockwise, still 3 shades of gray. We've got then 12 minus 5 or 7 steps counterclockwise, note half steps, which is still aqua but a shade darker. 5-2 modal range, XD modal range, mixolydian Dorian modal range, magenta, spring green modal range, 4 modal half steps clockwise, 4 shades of gray, 7 note half steps clockwise, or azure, -3 modal half steps counterclockwise, still 4 shades of gray, -5 note half steps counterclockwise, which gives us azure, a shade darker. 5-3 modal range, XP modal range, mixolydian Phrygian modal range, magenta to sky blue modal range, 5 modal half steps clockwise, 5 shades of gray, 9 note half steps clockwise, orchid. We have -2 modal half steps counterclockwise, still 5 shades of gray, -3 note half steps counterclockwise, still orchid, shade darker. 5-4, which is an XY modal range, mixolydian Lydian modal range, magenta blue modal range, 6 modal half steps forward, which would be 10 note half steps forward, which would be fuchsia, and -1 modal half steps counterclockwise, which would still be 6 shades of gray. 12 minus 10 is 2 note half steps counterclockwise, which would still be fuchsia, but a shade darker. What if we go from the good old aeolian? All the combos we can have that don't land us in the ocean, we can go 6, 6, 6, 7, 6, 1, 6, 2, 6, 3, 6, 4, 6, 5, or AA, AN, AI, AD, AP, AY, AX. And that's going to give us then a 6-6 modal range, AA modal range, 0 modal half steps, 0 note half steps, which is flame. We have the 6-7 modal range, which is the AN modal range, Aeolian Locrian modal range, the red-yellow modal range, 1 modal half step up, which is 1 shade of gray, 2 note half steps up, which is chartreuse, -6 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still 1 shade of gray, 12 minus 2 is -10 note half steps counterclockwise, which is still chartreuse, but a shade darker. We've got then the 6-1 modal range, the AI modal range, the Aeolian Ionian modal range, the red-green or yellow-green modal range, which is 2 modal half steps clockwise, 2 shades of gray, 3 note half steps clockwise, which would be lime, 5 modal half steps counterclockwise, which would still be 2 shades of gray, 12 minus 3 is 9 note half steps counterclockwise, which would still be lime, but a shade darker. We got the 7-2 modal range, the AD modal range, the Aeolian Dorian modal range, red spring green modal range, 3 modal half steps clockwise, 3 shades of gray, which is going to be 5 note half steps clockwise, or aqua, -4 modal half steps counterclockwise, still 3 shades of gray. 12 minus 3 gives us 7 note half steps counterclockwise, still aqua, but a shade darker. we've got the 6-3 modal range, the AP modal range, the Aeolian Phrygian modal range, the red sky blue modal range, 4 modal half steps clockwise, 7 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is azure. It's going to be -3 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still 4 shades of gray. 12 minus 7 is -5 note half steps counterclockwise, which is still azure, but a shade darker. We got the 7-4 modal range, the AY modal range, the Aeolian Lydian modal range, the red to the blue modal range. 5 modal half steps forward, 5 shades of gray, 8 note half steps forward, which is going to be grape. And that gives us 2 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still 5 shades of gray. That gives us 12 minus 8, which is 4 note half steps counterclockwise, which is still grape, but a shade darker. Finally, we've got the 6-5 modal range, the AX modal range, the Aeolian Mixolydian modal range, the red magenta modal range, 6 modal half steps forward. That's going to be 6 shades of gray. It's going to be 10 note half steps forward, which is fuchsia. We've got -1 modal half steps backwards or counterclockwise, which is still 6 shades of gray. And we have then 12 minus 10, which is going to be -2 note half steps counterclockwise, which is still fuchsia amber, but a shade darker. I'll just call it fuchsia ember. Okay, so then let's do one more round. So now we've got, what if I'm on the Locrian? What are all the continents I can get to from the Locrian? Well, you can go from 7-7, 7-1, 7-2, 7-3, 7-4, 7-5, 7-6, 7-7, which would be NN, NI, ND, NP, NY, NX, and NA. So what are the options there? If I go from 7 to 7, NN, Locrian, 0 modal half steps, 0 note half steps, which would be flame. If I go from 7 to 1, that would be Locrian Ionian. That would be NI modal range. That would be yellow to yellow-green modal range. 1 modal half step forward, 1 note half step forward, which would be 6 1 note half step, by the way, is amber. And then I could go 6 modal half steps counterclockwise, which would still be 1 shade of gray. 12 minus 1 would be 11 note half steps counterclockwise, which would still be amber, but a shade darker. 7-2 modal range is an ND modal range. Locrian Dorian modal range. Yellow to the spring green modal range. 2 modal half steps forward, which is 2 shades of gray. Would be 3 note half steps forward, which would be lime. -5 modal half steps counterclockwise, which would still be 2 shades of gray. 12 minus 3 would be 9 notes counterclockwise, which would still be lime, but a shade darker. 7-3 modal range, which would be NP modal range. Locrian Phrygian modal range. Yellow to sky blue modal range has a 3 modal half step forward, which is 3 shades of gray, would be 5 note half steps forward, which is aqua. And we could go 4 modal half steps counterclockwise, which would still be 3 shades of gray. 12 minus 5 would give us 7 note half steps counterclockwise, which is still aqua, but a shade darker. 7-4, which is going to be the NY modal range, Locrian Lydian modal range. Yellow to the blue modal range has 4 modal half steps forward or clockwise, which is 4 shades of gray. It would be 6 note half steps clockwise, which is the crazy electric sky. You're going to get electrocuted with that one, and because it's tensiony, and that's our tritone. And then it's going to be 3 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still 4 shades of gray. 12 minus 6 gets us another 6 note half steps counterclockwise, which is still that electric sky. Watch out, electric sky's up there. And so that's that. And so what if I go to the 7-5 modal range? That's an NX modal range, Locrian Mixolydian modal range, yellow to the magenta modal range. 5 modal half steps forward or clockwise, 5 shades of gray. It's going to be 8 note half steps clockwise or forward, which we're going to call grape. -2 modal half steps counterclockwise is still shades of gray 5. 12 minus 8 gives us 4 note half steps counterclockwise, which is still grape, but a shade darker. 7-6 modal range, which is Locrian Aeolian modal range, NA modal range, yellow to red modal range, 6 modal half steps forwards or clockwise, 6 shades of gray, 10 note half steps clockwise or forward, which is fuchsia. it's going to be -1 modal half steps counterclockwise, which is still 6 shades of gray. 12 minus 10 is -2 note half steps counterclockwise, which is still fuchsia, but a shade darker. All right. So we can see, so that's going to be, so we can see it from all of those different kind of ways to see it. So if I get bored of looking at it by number, I can look at it by letter. Or if I get bored of looking at it by letter, I can look at it by color. And then I can maneuver around there. And then all of that rich informational knowledge can be put onto one fretboard like this, even though it's crazy looking. And then we can use that to master the fretboard. Don't let the fretboard master. I am the master of the fretboard, not the other way around.